A few years ago, I typed up a list of personal experiences, ones I felt contributed to my deconversion from Christianity. It would eventually become the basis for my Losing God video series. However, on the same page, I made another list under the heading Exceptions. This list contained experiences that had served to strengthen my faith in God and, for a time, convince me of His existence. So for the sake of full disclosure, I think it would be fun if we dug through my personal X-Files and presented the other side of the story. In that way, you can see what passes as supernatural evidence in the mind of a charismatic evangelical Christian. "10 days. That's how much leave new Marines are granted after graduating from boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina. 10 days of sweet freedom. Then I'd have to report to Camp Lejeune for roughly 3 months of Marine combat training and the School of Infantry. So upon returning home from boot camp, you can imagine I wanted to cram a whole lot of fun into a short amount of time. Can you say road trip? On April 6, 1993, I gassed up my parents' Chevette and embarked on an all-day welcome back tour. The plan was to make a short pit stop at Shippensburg University, then drive down Interstate 76 to spend the remaining hours with friends in Martinsburg. The only condition was I had to be home by midnight. No excuses. All right, sounds like a plan. But as Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. My plan fell apart when I got lost in the backwoods of Appalachian country. Remember, kids, these were the dark ages before cell phones and Google Maps. After several hours of frustration, I finally rolled into my friend's driveway around 10 p.m., only to call my parents and learn they wanted me to turn around and drive home immediately. To this day, I've never quite understood why. I mean, I get it from an obedience standpoint. They gave me their car because I gave them my word I'd be home on time. But I never understood their decision from a safety perspective. I guess they didn't realize that boot camp had rearranged my internal clock. I wasn't used to driving long distances or staying awake past 9:30 p.m. And we're talking at least a 3-hour drive, and that's if I managed to make it to the interstate without getting lost again. So as you can imagine, the journey home was a long, grinding struggle against the Sandman. I tried every trick I could think of. Blaring music, rolling down the windows, even pulling into rest stops to do push-ups. But the seduction of sleep always quickly returned, like some soothing dark tide almost on the verge of washing over me. It was around 2 a.m. I was just 7 miles away from my exit when I finally lost the fight. The car bounced off the guardrail and slid onto the highway's shoulder. I was alive, I was safe, and I was definitely awake. Luckily, there was no other traffic on the road, so my reckless driving hadn't put anyone else at risk. The only injuries sustained were to the vehicle. There was a deep 2-foot wide dent in the driver's side door. Now, here's where things get interesting. The next day, my mom told me that my grandfather had woken up in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. in fact, because he felt compelled to pray for my safety. What a coincidence! My accident happened at roughly the same time. It took very little convincing for my mom and I to agree that the accident would have been a lot worse had it not been for the prayers of my faithful grandfather. So, was this a case of divine intervention? I suppose it's possible. It's also possible my grandfather, a driver's ed teacher of 20 years, heard from my parents that I was running late that night. He could have gone to bed with that fact on his mind. This would certainly account for any restless sleep he may have experienced without any appeal to the supernatural. Also, there was no way to verify whether my grandfather woke up before or after the accident. I was simply told he prayed sometime around 2 a.m. It's quite possible he prayed for me after the crash had already happened. There's just no way to know for sure. Now one could ask the question, why did the accident happen at all if God was protecting me? Well, funny you should ask. Toward the end of my senior year in high school, I ended up dating a foreign exchange student from Switzerland named Marta. Before leaving for boot camp, she wished me luck over the phone and said I was always welcome to visit her if I ever had the time and the money. Now, in 1993, a round-trip ticket to Switzerland plus a passport cost roughly $600, and after boot camp, I decided to put enough money aside so I could fly to Switzerland and visit Marta later that summer. But then the accident happened, and guess how much it cost to fix the door? That's right, $600. I had wrecked my parents' car door and my European vacation all in one night. It's sometimes said God closes one door so he can open another. But in my case, he closed one door by smashing the other one. The following summer, I dated a girl who was new to my home church. Her name was Vicky. One day in August, I was in the attic praying about our relationship. Okay, how do I put this? I heard a voice. Now, I can't say it was audible, but I heard what I thought was the voice of God as loudly as I've ever heard anything in my head. Concerning my relationship with Vicky, the voice said, "You will know tonight." Later, I picked Vicky up from her night class, and I could tell right away that something was wrong. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked. "You're going to tell me something I don't want to hear," she murmured. Vicky then told me she too had been praying about our relationship earlier in the morning, but she felt God had answered by informing her that I was going to break up with her that evening. Whoa, talk about a coincidence. Now, I'd like to say we heeded God's warning and went our separate ways after that. But like the Israelites of old, Vicky and I ignored God's clear warning and stayed together for another 4 months. After which I finally weaseled my way out of the relationship in the most cowardly, passive-aggressive way possible. Yeah, I should have listened to that voice. I think this event is a little harder to dismiss than the other one. Sure, it's possible the voices we heard were simply manifestations of religious guilt. After all, we had been struggling with how physical our romantic relationship had been getting at the time, and that's a surefire way to generate Christian guilt. But to have those voices manifest on the same day and in the same way, it's still a pretty big coincidence. If you wanted more evidence I have no business driving after midnight, we have this next story. One night in the fall of 1994, I left Vicky's house after 12 a.m. to drive back to Shippensburg. The last thing I remember before my eyes closed was passing the sign for the Grantville, Pennsylvania exit. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the sign for the Wurtzville, Mechanicsburg exit. Wait, Mechanicsburg? I was instantly awake and terrified all at the same time. The distance between Grantville and Mechanicsburg is 20 miles. I had been asleep for 20 straight minutes. This wasn't like the Martinsburg trip. Sure, I had experienced weaving in and out of consciousness back then, but not for more than a few seconds, and it only took seconds to hit that guardrail. However, this event took things to a whole new level. I had shut my eyes and lost a 20-minute block of time. Needless to say, I spent the rest of the drive desperately thanking God that I hadn't killed anyone or myself by driving so recklessly. So, did God protect my dumbass for the second time? Or was I just really, really lucky the highway didn't have any sharp turns between Grantville and Mechanicsburg? I report, you decide. Ever have a nightmare? I mean, one of those night terrors that burrows into your psyche and lingers for hours. I experienced a few of those growing up, but no matter how scary they were, I always took comfort in the fact that when I woke up, I knew the nightmare was over and I was safe. Not so with this next experience. In June of 1995, I woke up late in the morning after an uneventful night's sleep. The problem was, I couldn't move. Now, I could tell I was awake. The room looked like it should, the sun was up, the world around me appeared perfectly normal, but I just wasn't able to move my body. Then I felt it next to me, just outside of my field of vision. A dark, ominous presence was nearby. I was terrified. It felt like a nightmare, but I wasn't asleep. The presence spoke, and it said, "Turn around." I was too frightened to move even if I could, so I did the only thing I could think of. I called out to Jesus in my mind. I started saying, "Jesus loves me, this I know," and immediately the dark presence and the paralysis vanished. I was free. Just to be clear, I'd had bad dreams before. I knew exactly what they felt like. But whatever this was, it was different. I was so beside myself, I called in late to work. Next, I phoned my youth pastor and rapidly explained everything that had happened. He couldn't make any sense of it either. I've had nightmares since that time, but nothing that could ever rival that experience. Well, what do you think? Did a hell-spawned demonic spirit travel all the way to my bedside just to mess with me for a few seconds? Did the power of a Christian nursery rhyme compel the evil spirit to leave? Those are certainly possibilities. Of course, it was easy to jump to those conclusions in the years before I learned about sleep paralysis. Temporary immobility and the feeling of an evil presence are both common traits of this phenomenon, and it's well documented within the medical community. It's also possible I had recently watched the movie Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. The "turnaround" movie line may have been lingering on the surface of my subconscious, because after all, the movie is awesome. I think those may be reasonable possibilities as well. It was called the Blizzard of '96. The storm dumped over 30 inches of snow in central Pennsylvania, more snow than we'd seen in 13 years. This meant there was plenty of shoveling to be done. A chiropractor from my church moved her practice roughly 4 blocks away from my house. Her parking area was just small enough that finding a plow truck would have been a waste of money, so my parents volunteered me to help her shovel her property. All went well for the first hour, except I had a throbbing headache that continued to grow as time progressed. Maybe I was dehydrated, maybe the glare from the snow contributed to it. I have no idea. What I do know is that by the 2-hour mark, I still had a long way to go, and my head felt like it was going to split open. So I took a break for a few minutes. Part of me wanted to go home, while the other part just wanted to get the job done so I wouldn't have to come back later. So as a last resort, I put my hand where the pain was and asked God if he would remove the headache. And guess what? The headache, moved. I kid you not. The pain moved from one side of my head to the other. I wasn't sure what to do, so I touched the new area and prayed again. But the headache moved to another part of my head. Finally, after chasing it around a few times, I covered my head with both hands and asked God to heal the headache once and for all. And he did. In an instant, the intense pain immediately vanished. You can imagine I was pretty stunned and relieved all at the same time. I even shook my head violently just to see if I was experiencing a temporary placebo effect. But I wasn't mistaken. Every trace of the headache was gone, and it never returned. Jesus said to his disciples, "Whatever you ask in my name, this I will do." The passage in John 14 certainly seemed appropriate at that time. I mean, I had a definite need, I asked Jesus to heal me, and he did. Well, after chasing the pain around for a few moments first. However, it's also possible that resting for a couple minutes helped the problem, and that my prayers just happened to coincide with my body's natural healing processes. However, it doesn't explain why the headache kept moving at my touch, or why it didn't come back once I began shoveling again. There has never been another instance where my headaches have spontaneously disappeared after a short rest. But then again, I prayed over plenty of other headaches while I was a believer, and I was never healed in any of those instances. Okay, with this next event, I'm just going to come right out and say it. God helped me find my keys. I know, it sounds so cliche. I can just hear it now. So you're saying God intervened to find your keys, but he won't help African children dying of AIDS? Yeah, I get that. I know how trivial it sounds, but trust me, the story gets a bit more complicated. Here's a fun fact about myself. I lose track of things very easily. I've had this problem practically my entire life. In order to combat this as an adult, I've had to develop my own system of organization that relies primarily on repetition. Unfortunately, I did not have this safety net developed while in college, and nothing highlights this better than my mishandling of keys. When I lived on campus, I'd lock myself out of my room at least once every other week because I'd forget my dorm keys, or sometimes I'd forget where I placed them. It certainly didn't help that I kept my dorm and car keys separate for some reason. You can just imagine how loved I was by the resident assistant, who had to come to my rescue every time I came knocking. This brings us to January 1996. I would say it was a time of new beginnings. I was living off campus with some good friends, and I had just started dating the girl I would eventually marry in a few years. So once Christmas vacation ended, I packed my car and drove back to Shippensburg to begin the spring semester. It was a long drive, but I figured once I finished unpacking, I would grab a quick bite to eat, then head over to my girlfriend's apartment to enjoy the rest of the evening. I pulled up to the apartment, walked to the door, and quickly discovered I didn't have my apartment keys. Idiot. I must have left them at my parents' house. And to make matters worse, my two roommates were nowhere to be found. I was completely out of luck. So much for that relaxing evening I was hoping for. I slammed the car door and made the hour-and-a-half trip back to Lebanon, only to realize I couldn't find the keys there either. I retraced all of my steps. I checked the basement, the kitchen, the dining room, both living rooms, all 3 bathrooms, the study, the porch. I sifted through couch cushions and lifted furniture. I looked everywhere I could have possibly been. But with each failure, I grew more frustrated at my own shortcomings. What was wrong with me? Why did I always forget things? Was this some kind of learning disability? So despite 4.5 hours of driving and several hours of searching, I finally returned to Shippensburg empty-handed and deflated. Fast forward 5 months. I was in my parents' basement recovering from the painting accident that had just happened. If I remember correctly, I was sitting on the couch playing Ogre Battle on the Super Nintendo when I felt something metallic fall on my left shoulder. I looked over, and there they were, my apartment keys. Now, I need to be clear, I was completely alone in the house. No one could have snuck up behind me and dropped the keys without me seeing them. More importantly, no one could walk around the basement without me hearing them. But there was no one there. Well, no one human, anyway. So what should we take away from this? On one hand, I recognize the keys as yet another sign of God's providence, as if I really needed any more signs that summer. I know, teleporting keys seems like a pretty lame use of God's superpowers, but you have to remember that many Christians don't see it that way. They believe in a God who is interested in every facet of their lives, especially the small stuff. So when they get on Facebook and credit God for providing a new job or for locating the perfect family minivan, it's not so much about God hating African kids with AIDS, but about how he really, really loves his adopted spiritual children. And that's what I got out of the falling keys, God's love. On the other hand, getting back my apartment keys in June only served as a symbolic gesture, since my roommates and I had already moved out of that apartment 1 month earlier. But I guess it's the thought that counts. Also, I had to consider the very real possibility that nothing supernatural had occurred at all. What if I'd left the keys on top of the couch back in January? And what if I just happened to be sitting down at the right place and the right time when the keys fell? That sure sounds more plausible than God did it, right? I mean, if the keys hadn't fallen on my shoulder, they would have fallen on the couch cushion instead, and then I'd be giving God credit for dropping the keys on the couch. But that's another thing. If I had shifted on the couch or moved abruptly, then I wouldn't have initially connected the falling keys to anything supernatural. I would have assumed they got bumped. But I remember thinking at the time I had been sitting there quietly for a while. The only parts of my body that were moving were my fingers over that sweet Super Nintendo controller. And how was it possible that not one person noticed a pair of bronze keys sitting on top of the couch for 5 straight months? So many questions. And now it's time for the grand finale. It's time for the videotape. Our story begins way back on May 30th, 1992, when my family and friends succeeded in pulling off a masterstroke, a surprise birthday party in my honor that was actually a surprise. The whole thing had a "this is your life" kind of vibe to it, and the party was absolutely magical. What really made it special was the fact that some of the best and goofiest parts of the night were captured on home video. So whenever I returned home from college, one of my weekly traditions was to pop the tape in the old VCR and relive those great memories over and over again. You know that clip of Chevy Chase in Christmas Vacation? Yeah, that was me in a nutshell. As time passed, more memories were added to the tape. A special day with my family, the night I left for the Marines, the day I graduated from the Marines, and so on. So much nostalgia was packed into one 90-minute tape that it eventually became my most treasured possession. If someone gave me the choice between $1,000 or that VHS tape, there would simply be no contest. The tape would win. Then in July of 1996, I learned that my old Swiss girlfriend, Marta, was returning to the US. She was part of a Swiss dance troupe touring North America, and while in Pennsylvania, she decided to visit her old host family, Mr. and Mrs. Dressler. When I stopped by the Dresslers' home, I brought the videotape along because Marta had been one of the guests at the party, and I thought it would be fun to relive old memories. 2 weeks later, I tried looking for the tape in my parents' video collection, but it wasn't there. Then I remembered. The last time I watched the tape was with Marta. I must have left the tape at the Dresslers. So I drove to their home and explained what had happened, and of course they were more than happy to help me find it. I hit the eject button on their VCR and no birthday tape. I looked through their small library of home videos. Again, no tape. We scoured their living room for 15 minutes, but despite their help, we couldn't find the tape anywhere. Remember how angry I got with myself over those apartment keys? Well, imagine the rage and despair I felt over losing the most sentimental thing I owned, and it was entirely my fault. All of the insecurity I felt during the keys debacle came rushing back like a flood. As the years passed, I would sometimes call my mom and ask if she would mind checking with the Dresslers to see if they'd found my tape. Mom knew how much the video meant to me, and I know she looked into it because the Dresslers' daughter, Amy, went to my old church. Unfortunately, the answer was always, "Sorry, honey, they couldn't find it." Every time Christmas or my birthday approached, part of me held out hope that somehow my mom had gotten hold of the tape, and she had it wrapped and waiting for me with a big bow on top. That would have been the best present I ever received, but it was always wishful thinking. In 2010, Mom told me she had a big surprise for my birthday. To find out what it was, I had to complete a scavenger hunt. I tried to lower my expectations, but I couldn't help but get excited. Could it be the tape? It has to be. I mean, why else would she make a big deal over a birthday present? Yeah, it turned out the scavenger hunt led to a box filled with merchandise from my favorite TV series, Lost. Although I appreciated the thoughtfulness behind the gifts, I have to admit, the disappointment really hit hard that time. It's now November 15th, 2010. My internal alarm clock kicked in and woke me up on the couch at 3 a.m. in the morning, just enough time to get ready for work. I must have dozed off while watching TV the night before. My wife knew how difficult it was to wake her slumbering ogre once I closed my eyes, so she had left me at peace in the living room. I dragged myself over to the kitchen, and there was a note lying on the table addressed to me. I just figured it was a list of grocery items my wife wanted me to buy after work. I picked up the note, and it said this: "Your mom called while you were sleeping. She found your birthday tape." So here's what happened. In August of that year, my mom and I were talking about the recent passing of Mr. Dressler. I decided to ask her if she would touch base with Amy for one last sweep of her parents' video library just for my peace of mind. I knew the chance was pretty slim since the Dresslers had already moved at least once within the last decade. If no tape was found, then I would never ask about it again, and I'd try my best to move on. But Mom, being the awesome person that she is, said she would look into it. However, several weeks went by before she saw Amy again, and by that point, she completely forgot about my request. I didn't dare bring it up again because, in some ways, I was afraid of the answer. So 3 months went by. Then on November 14th, my mom suddenly remembered her promise. Kevin! She picked up the phone and called Amy. It turns out, Amy and her family were moving Mrs. Dressler to a retirement home on that same day. They were in the process of packing up a few of her belongings while selling or discarding everything else. Mom asked if they had kept any of their home videos, and Amy said they kept a few while the rest they tossed in the dumpster. Now, if it were me, this would have been the point when I threw in the towel and gave up. But my mom persisted. She asked Amy if one of her children would be willing to check the dumpster in the hope of locating my video. We're talking the proverbial needle in a haystack here. But to her surprise, Amy volunteered. The 53-year-old woman climbed into the trash, and when she finally emerged, she was holding my tape. Sherry later called my mom called my house, but by that point I was fast asleep on the couch and missed the call. So when I read my wife's note, I dropped to my knees and remained there for a good 5 minutes. All I could do was sit on the floor and praise God for caring about something that, in the grand scheme of things, was so small. But to me, it meant erasing 14 years of regret. And then 6 months later, I was an atheist. What should we make of this event? My most sentimental possession on earth was doomed to a landfill if it hadn't been for the kindness of Mom, Amy Dressler, and perhaps God's providence. Could it be pure coincidence that my mom remembered the tape on the same day it was thrown in the trash? If my mom had waited until the next day, it would have been too late. If she had waited even a few hours, the dumpster may have been filled to such a degree that it would have been impractical or even dangerous to ask someone to climb inside. I mean, how was it possible the Dresslers had never stumbled upon the tape over 14 years, and yet somehow it was easily identified while lying in the trash? This had to be the biggest coincidence I had ever experienced. On the other hand, does coincidence require a higher power? It may have felt like I'd won the lottery. However, I'm sure I had a much higher chance of finding the video than actually winning the lottery. And people win lotteries all the time without divine assistance. Mr. and Mrs. Dressler were wonderful people, but perhaps they simply hadn't looked for the tape as intensely as I would have wanted them to. And so with that, we'll conclude story time for today. What did you think of my experiences? Did you find them interesting, strange, a bit silly, or maybe you don't know what to think? Where have you found God in some of life's more mysterious moments? Feel free to share them in the comments section below. I have a lot of exciting videos planned this year, so I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.